Hello and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be diving into Lecture 4, The Wild Wild West. So here are your objectives, the questions you'll be expected to answer at the end, so take a moment and pause and write these down. And without further ado, let's dive in. So today we're going to discuss the Wild West and the way in which industrial society merged with the frontier and created a whole new sort of ecosystem in which American history could build and grow. So the reason that the Wild West happened is just like the reason that the Industrial Revolution happened and the Gilded Age happened. In the end, it comes down to the railroads. Railroads, of course, substantially improved transportation throughout most of the Northeast during the first rail boom. But of course, as we remember, they would start traversing the West, during the Civil War, especially with the passing of the Pacific Railway Act. And so the Transcontinental Railroad would eventually be completed in 1869. And by the mid-Gilded Age, we'd have several different railroads crisscrossing the country and especially connecting through both the middle of the country, the northern portion, and then finally several southern transcontinental railroads connecting the West Coast to, of course, the heavily industrialized Northeast. But what we're going to be looking at today is, as opposed to those regions, the way the railroads also transformed the area that they passed through. So we're looking at the middle of the country and sort of the southwestern area, and how those different places were affected by industrialization and the growth of this modern economy. One of the ways, of course, is as they moved through and as people began to settle these areas, they started to discover gold and silver. We, of course, remember the famous gold rush in 1849 out in San Francisco. But what's less well known is the massive gold and silver rushes that we saw throughout the Rocky Mountain states in the 2 to 3 decades after that time period. These gold and silver rushes often had very similar effects to the population boom that the gold rush of 49 created for San Francisco. And so it substantially increased the population and encouraged people to move out there and seek their fortune, to get rich. Obviously, this also brought railroads, and from there brought crime and the famous train robbers of this time period, and led to massive boom towns, which, of course, if a wealthy lode was discovered, what you'd end up seeing is a huge influx of population to work this mine for a time. And then generally these boom towns would fade away as, of course, the amount of gold and silver dried up. And all of a sudden there was very little reason for young sort of adventure-seeking men to live in these towns in the West where there were no jobs. This is not always the case. Denver is a famous example of a boom town that ended up sort of maintaining its population. But Virginia City, of course, and a number of other of these boom towns would quickly fade from consciousness, and people would move on to their next sort of get-rich opportunity. Of course, this also opened the door for our old friend speculation, because, of course, if you're hearing about all these gold mines in the West, everyone wants to buy up stretches of land, hoping that they will discover the next sort of the next mother lode and the next vein of gold and silver, and be able to turn that into incredible wealth. And so, of course, you get a lot of lies from people about where gold and silver is located, which pushes up the value of Western land and leads to a number of speculative bubbles that help to sort of burst the economy. Most famously, contributing to 1873, which we're going to be talking about later. We've talked previously about how speculative bubbles build and then burst, and the long-term effect. And of course, it's worthwhile to note that it's not just the people holding the land when the speculative bubble bursts that are affected, because of course, the effects of this sort of cascade throughout the banking system, leading to bank failures and significant hardship for lots of people. The industrialization of the Gilded Age also led to the expanded settlement of the Great Plains states. The Great Plains, the area that sort of covers the center of the country between the Mississippi River Valley and the Rocky Mountains, was not settled earlier for a couple of different reasons. We already sort of talked about Zebulon Pike and his Great American Desert that he wrote on this map that kept people away. But The other issue is the topsoil of the prairie is very difficult to sort of plow up. A lot of these areas don't have significant amounts of regular rainfall, and then the soil is shallow and rocky. So it required new technology such as John Deere's steel plow, which was more effectively able to plow up the prairie topsoil, that opened up significant amounts of this territory, of this land, to settlement. And this was benefited by increasing land grants. We, of course, remember the Homestead Act, which was part of Lincoln's platform back in 1860. But we see a couple other types of land grants, including the Rock and Stone Act and the Timber Culture Act. This created a greater incentive for people to move out into the Great Plains by increasing the amount of land they could get if they would plant it with trees. This was beneficial both because it created windbreaks in order to keep the soil in place, because of course if we're plowing up the prairie topsoil, it makes the region much more sort of susceptible to dust storms. And by planting windbreaks, you can sort of prevent that. And then also, of course, it's going to provide, hopefully, a future source of revenue and timber. So the Timber Culture Act increased settlement to the west, and of course led to the sort of the tree lines and some of the features that you see as you drive through sort of more isolated areas. Obviously, as people got more land, this opened up more land to cultivation, and we started getting sort of larger scale factory farms as technology increased. New threshing machines and other pieces of technology allowed people to single-handedly farm and cultivate more land. And so we start to see much larger farms out in these western states because, of course, the land is not near as fertile and productive as it is in some of the old Midwestern states. And so you need to have more land in order to make sort of the same amount of revenue. We also have the rise of the cattle kingdom during this time. Cattle, as we hopefully remember, were not native to the Americas, but were introduced as part of the Columbian Exchange. But cattle being relatively hardy animals, they ended up multiplying and spreading throughout the Southwest, creating this vast natural resource of just herds of cattle out in Texas and those sort of areas. This led to the famous cattle drive, as ranchers and cowboys would round up cattle from places like Texas and drive them across several states north to the railheads in places like Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. Obviously, large herds of cattle traveling across country was somewhat difficult, but because the cows were naturally occurring, you could make significant amounts of money just going and rounding up wild cattle and driving them north. Obviously, over time, this is going to become a more sophisticated industrial business. And as railheads get closer to Texas, this business is going to sort of fade away. But we have this sort of romanticized 10-year period of the open range, where cowboys could go out and seek their fortune, rounding up wild cattle and driving them north to these cow towns, where they could make significant amounts of money, spend it on creature comforts and sinful pleasures, and then head south to get more cows again. It's a way for young American men to go test themselves against the open range. Very exciting and romantic. Obviously, this also led to conflict, both within the cattle towns and with outlaws stealing money from cowboys and all of these other sort of things that we associate with the Wild West. And of course, bandits and cattle rustlers and all this become part of the sort of mythos of the Wild West, as does the sheriff who goes out to tame the sort of wildness of this vast, untamed, quote unquote, land in the West. Obviously, as an aside, there's a lot of Native Americans still living on this land, and they might sort of object to this sort of romanticization of the cowboy era and the Wild West, but we'll talk about them tomorrow. Finally, the cattle towns represent boom towns in a very real sense. It's this sort of this community, very temporary community, designed for the cultivation and profit of a single industry. And so as long as the railhead exists and cowboys are showing up, the population of a place like Dodge City is relatively large. Whereas, of course, once the railroads move closer to Texas, Dodge City is going to become the Dodge City we know and love today. But in its heyday, it was a relatively large, thriving cattle community with a very sort of high saloon to church ratio, catering to the needs and desires of mostly young, unmarried men. By the 1880s, the open range ends for a couple different reasons. One is a massive blizzard kills approximately 90% of the wild cattle in Texas in the winter of 1886 to 1887. The harshness of this blizzard, coupled with the drought that had happened the season before, had already weakened the cattle herds. And so cows who were not sheltered and did not have a steady supply of food were simply wiped out. But barbed wire also greatly contributed to the decline of the cattle kingdom and the West. Barbed wire, of course, is a relatively inexpensive way to fence off territory and to prevent cows from wandering. So as this happened more regularly, the land was instead parceled up to individual ranchers who would use it for their own profit, as opposed to this sort of wild west of cowboys and quick money rounding up wild cattle. So the effects of all of this stuff. One, of course, we see the great expansion of the railroad into other areas, specifically areas in the West, where if we hadn't discovered gold and silver, would anyone really be building a railroad to Wyoming? I'm going to say no. Secondarily, we start to see new innovations as this happens, and we get a steady supply of meat in places like Kansas City, which quickly becomes known for its meat processing and beef business. So if you want to know why Kansas City is famous for steak, it's famous for steak because it was one of the places that these cattle were shipped to in order to be processed to then be moved to urban centers. So it builds the character of a lot of these Midwest cities. It, of course, also provides new products and significantly more beef in the diet of Americans, which prior to this would have eaten far, far less meat because, of course, it would have been so much more expensive. And it leads to new innovations like the refrigerated rail car, which allows beef to become moved into these areas in a much more sort of fresh state as opposed to having to be smoked or processed or something else. So Swift's refrigerator rail cars, of course, help build railroad monopolies and fit into the whole the growth of big business that we talked about in previous lessons. And the size of cities substantially increases as the food supply, both from opening up the vast lands of the plains to farming, and also all of these new this new amount of significant growth in livestock, leads people to be able to eat more and have greater access to food. And so all of this sort of fits together, and the West becomes part of the massive growth of the United States in the Gilded Age, both facilitated by and partially facilitating the growth of urban centers and big business. So that brings us back to our objectives. Hopefully you can answer these questions. And when we come back, we'll talk about the Native Americans who, of course, were living on this land and were somewhat skeptical of all of these Americans coming in and developing it.